Elite police officers sworn to protect their communities vanished behind a wall of corruption and greed, leaving their departments and the public they served betrayed and devastated. But 3 years later, federal agents burst through their doors with handcuffs and indictments, exposing a criminal empire that would shock law enforcement across the nation. The Gun Trace Task Force was supposed to be Baltimore's answer to rising gun violence. These hand-picked officers were the cream of the crop, trusted with the most dangerous assignments and given extraordinary powers to get illegal weapons off the streets. Sergeant Wayne Jenkins led this elite squad with the swagger of a decorated war hero and the respect of his peers. Detective Momodu Gondo had grown up in the very neighborhoods he now patrolled, giving him street credibility that money could not buy. Detective Jamel Rayam was known for his aggressive pursuit of drug dealers and his ability to get results when others failed. But beneath their badges and behind their sworn oaths, these men were operating the most audacious criminal enterprise in Baltimore police history. They were not just bending the rules, they were smashing them to pieces while building their own illegal empire worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. For years, they robbed citizens during traffic stops, stole drugs and resold them on the streets, falsified overtime records to steal money from taxpayers, and covered their tracks with fake reports and intimidation. They used their police powers to commit home invasions, planted evidence on innocent people, and terrorized the very communities they were supposed to protect. The corruption was not limited to Baltimore. In New York City, officers James Davnero and Giancarlo Osma were running their own scheme, steering accident victims to a tow truck company operated by their former colleague Michael Perry in exchange for thousands of dollars in cash bribes. Meanwhile, on the West Coast, California officers were falsifying college degrees to fraudulently obtain salary increases and distributing illegal steroids while destroying evidence to cover their tracks. These were not isolated incidents or rogue officers acting alone. This was systematic corruption that had infected multiple police departments across the country, with officers who believed they were above the law they were sworn to uphold. But the Federal Bureau of Investigation was watching. For months, agents had been building cases, gathering evidence, and preparing to bring down what would become one of the largest police corruption scandals in American history. The investigation would expose not just individual crimes, but a culture of impunity that had allowed these officers to operate with virtually no oversight. The reckoning was coming, and when it arrived, it would send shockwaves through law enforcement agencies from coast to coast. The Baltimore Police Department's Gun Trace Task Force was created in 2007 with a noble mission to get illegal firearms off the streets and reduce the gun violence that was plaguing the city. The unit was designed to be a surgical strike team composed of the department's most experienced and trusted officers who could move quickly and decisively against armed criminals. Wayne Jenkins seemed like the perfect candidate to lead such a unit. The 37-year-old sergeant had 14 years of experience with the Baltimore Police Department and a reputation for being fearless in the face of danger. His colleagues respected him for his willingness to take on the most dangerous assignments, and his supervisors praised him for his ability to get results. Jenkins had been wounded in the line of duty and was considered a hero by many in the department. Under Jenkins' leadership, the Gun Trace Task Force was given extraordinary latitude to operate throughout the city. Unlike regular patrol officers who were confined to specific districts, these officers could go anywhere and investigate anyone they suspected of carrying illegal weapons. They worked primarily in plain clothes, drove unmarked vehicles, and operated with minimal supervision. Momodu Gondo brought a different kind of credibility to the team. The 30-year-old detective had grown up in West Baltimore, in the same neighborhoods where the task force would conduct many of its operations. His childhood friends included some of the people who had turned to dealing drugs, giving him valuable insights into how the street-level drug trade operated. Gondo was known for his ability to develop informants and gather intelligence about where guns and drugs were being hidden. Gondo's connection to the community was seen as a major asset by his supervisors. He could speak the language of the streets and navigate relationships that might be difficult for officers from outside the area. His colleagues trusted him to provide accurate information about suspects and locations, and his arrest record was impressive enough to earn him a spot on the elite unit. Jamel Rayam was the aggressive enforcement arm of the operation. The 34-year-old detective had built his reputation on his willingness to pursue drug dealers relentlessly and his ability to recover significant amounts of drugs and money during searches. Rayam was known for his interrogation skills and his talent for getting suspects to reveal the locations of hidden stashes. What made Rayam particularly valuable to the unit was his willingness to take risks that other officers might avoid. He was not afraid to chase suspects through dangerous neighborhoods or to confront armed individuals. His arrest reports consistently showed large seizures of drugs, money, and weapons, making him appear to be one of the most productive officers in the department. The gun trace task force operated out of a warehouse in East Baltimore, away from the main police headquarters and the oversight that came with working in a traditional precinct. The officers had access to sophisticated surveillance equipment, vehicles seized from drug dealers, and a budget that allowed them to purchase information from confidential informants. Their success was measured primarily by the number of guns they recovered and the amount of drugs and money they seized. The unit was under pressure to produce impressive statistics that could be presented to city officials and the media as evidence that the police department was making progress in the fight against gun violence. The officers knew that as long as they continued to generate headlines with dramatic drug busts and gun seizures, they would face little scrutiny about their methods. The culture of the department rewarded results over process, and the gun trace task force was producing results that made everyone look good. But beneath the surface of their apparent success, the officers were building something entirely different. They were creating a criminal enterprise that would use their police powers to steal, extort, and terrorize the people they were supposed to protect. The very skills that made them effective at investigating drug dealers would be turned toward their own criminal purposes. The trust that their supervisors placed in them would become the shield that protected their illegal activities. The lack of oversight that allowed them to operate effectively against armed criminals would also allow them to operate as armed criminals themselves. The transformation from police officers to criminals did not happen overnight. It began with small compromises, minor rule violations that gradually escalated into major felonies. Wayne Jenkins would later admit that the corruption started with keeping some of the money they seized during drug raids instead of turning it all in as evidence. At first, it was just a few $100s here and there. The officers rationalized that they were taking money from drug dealers who had obtained it illegally anyway. They convinced themselves that keeping some of the cash was a form of rough justice, a way of ensuring that crime did not pay. The amounts were small enough that they were unlikely to be noticed, and the victims were criminals who were unlikely to file complaints. But the temptation proved impossible to resist, and the amounts quickly grew larger. During one raid on a suspected drug dealer's home, Jenkins and his team discovered a safe containing more than $200,000 in cash. Instead of seizing all of it as evidence, Jenkins took half the money and instructed his officers to reseal the safe. He then had them create a cell phone video showing them opening the safe again, this time discovering only $100,000 inside. The fake video was submitted as evidence in the case, creating a permanent record of what appeared to be the actual amount of money seized. The missing $100,000 was split among the officers, with Jenkins keeping the largest share. The drug dealer who owned the money had no way to prove that more had been taken, and even if he had tried to complain, his credibility would have been destroyed by his status as a criminal defendant. This success emboldened the officers to attempt even more audacious thefts. Gondo began using his connections in the drug trade, not just to gather intelligence, but to identify profitable targets for robbery. He would learn about drug dealers who kept large amounts of cash or drugs in their homes, then share that information with Jenkins and the rest of the team. The officers developed elaborate schemes to make their robberies appear legitimate. They would conduct surveillance on their targets, then wait for an opportunity to pull them over or search their homes under the pretense of a routine investigation. Once they had gained access to the money or drugs, they would steal what they wanted and file false reports claiming that they had seized smaller amounts. Rayam proved particularly skilled at intimidating victims who might be tempted to complain about their treatment. He would threaten to plant additional evidence or to have the victims charged with more serious crimes if they caused any trouble. Most of the people they robbed were already facing criminal charges and could not afford to antagonize the officers who would be testifying against them. The corruption soon expanded beyond simple theft. Jenkins began planting evidence on people he wanted to arrest, including placing 28 grams of heroin on a man who was subsequently sent to prison. The false evidence was used to justify searches that yielded real drugs and money, creating a cycle where fabricated crimes were used to enable the commission of actual crimes. The officers also began selling the drugs they stole. Jenkins developed a relationship with a bail bondsman who agreed to sell marijuana, heroin, and cocaine on his behalf. The arrangement was simple. Jenkins would leave large quantities of drugs in a shed behind the bondsman's house, and the bondsman would sell them and split the proceeds with Jenkins. This partnership generated thousands of dollars in additional income for the corrupt officers. To cover their tracks, The officers systematically falsified their overtime records. They claimed to be working when they were actually at home, attending personal appointments, or conducting their illegal side businesses. The fraudulent overtime claims allowed them to steal money directly from the city's payroll, while also providing alibis for times when they might have been committing other crimes. The fake overtime scheme was particularly brazen, because it required the officers to submit detailed reports about work they had never actually performed. They would claim to have conducted surveillance operations, interviewed witnesses, or processed evidence during hours when they were nowhere near their assigned duties. The false reports were approved by supervisors who trusted the officers and did not verify their claims. Jenkins even went so far as to plan home invasions using police equipment and intelligence. After his arrest, federal agents discovered a cache of tools and weapons in his possession, including brass knuckles, an 18-inch machete, a sledgehammer, a grappling hook, and several black masks. These items were intended for use in breaking into homes to steal money and drugs from unsuspecting victims. The criminal enterprise became so sophisticated that the officers were essentially operating two separate organizations, their official police unit and their unofficial criminal gang. They used the resources of one to support the activities of the other, creating a feedback loop that made their crimes both more profitable and more difficult to detect. While the Baltimore Gun Trace Task Force was operating their criminal empire on the East Coast, similar corruption was taking root in police departments across the country. The problems were not isolated to one city or one unit, but represented a broader crisis of accountability in American law enforcement. In New York City, officers James Davnero and Giancarlo Osmer had discovered their own lucrative scheme that exploited their positions with the New York Police Department. Both officers were assigned to the 107th Precinct in Queens, where they regularly responded to automobile accidents throughout their patrol area. The city's Directed Accident Response Program required officers to identify appropriate licensed tow truck and automobile repair businesses to respond to accident scenes and remove damaged vehicles. The system was designed to ensure that accident victims received fair treatment and that towing and repair services were distributed equitably among licensed operators. But Davnero and Osmer saw an opportunity to profit from their position. Instead of following the required procedures, they began steering damaged vehicles exclusively to a business operated by Michael Perry, a former police officer who had retired from the department in June of 2020. In exchange for this preferential treatment, Perry paid the two active officers thousands of dollars in cash bribes. The scheme was elegantly simple and highly profitable. Every time Davnero and Osmer responded to an accident scene, they had the power to determine which tow truck company would be called to remove the damaged vehicles. By consistently directing this business to Perry's company, they ensured that he received a steady stream of customers that he would not have obtained through legitimate means. Perry's business benefited enormously from this arrangement. Towing and repair work generated by automobile accidents was particularly valuable because it was often covered by insurance companies, meaning that payment was virtually guaranteed. The officers were essentially delivering customers who came with built-in financing, making the bribes a worthwhile investment for Perry. Meanwhile, on the West Coast, corruption had taken on an even more systematic character in Northern California police departments. 10 officers from the Antioch and Pittsburgh police departments were arrested after a 2-year Federal Bureau of Investigation inquiry uncovered a wide range of criminal activities that went far beyond simple financial fraud. The California case revealed what prosecutors described as a college degree benefits fraud involving 6 officers who had falsified their educational credentials to obtain salary increases and tuition reimbursements. The departments offered financial incentives to officers who earned college degrees, including pay raises and reimbursement for educational expenses. Rather than actually attending classes and earning degrees through legitimate means, the officers hired other people to attend classes and take exams on their behalf. They then submitted fake transcripts and degree certificates to their departments, fraudulently claiming educational achievements that entitled them to higher salaries and benefits. The scheme required careful coordination and planning. The officers had to find people willing to impersonate them in classes, ensure that the fake students could pass the required exams, and create convincing documentation to support their fraudulent claims. The conspiracy involved multiple people over an extended period, and generated thousands of dollars in illegal benefits for each participating officer. But the educational fraud was only the beginning of the corruption in California. The investigation also revealed that 2 Antioch officers had been distributing anabolic steroids, with one of them agreeing to destroy evidence of their illegal activities. The steroid distribution scheme showed how officers were willing to use their positions to engage in drug dealing, just like their counterparts in Baltimore. Even more disturbing were the civil rights violations that federal prosecutors described as a disturbing litany of illegal conduct by 3 Antioch officers. These officers had been systematically abusing their authority to commit acts of violence against members of the public, then bragging about their crimes in text messages to their colleagues. One officer who worked with a police dog took photographs and videos of injuries inflicted by dog bites and shared them on his personal cell phone with other officers who had not been involved in the incidents. On December 19, 2019, he wrote to his colleagues, "I am going to take more gory pics. Gory pics are for personal stuff, cleaned up pics for the case." Another officer took photographs of injuries he had inflicted on people using less lethal ammunition, then collected the spent rounds to create what he called a mantle and trophy flag. The officer was literally creating souvenirs from acts of violence against members of the public, treating police brutality as a recreational activity worthy of commemoration. The text messages between the officers revealed a culture of impunity and violence that extended far beyond individual misconduct. These officers believed they could abuse their authority with impunity, and they were encouraging each other to commit increasingly serious crimes against the people they were supposed to protect. The scope of the corruption across these different jurisdictions demonstrated that the problems were not isolated incidents, but part of a broader crisis in police accountability. Officers in Baltimore, New York, and California had all found ways to exploit their positions for personal gain, whether through theft, fraud, or violence. The culture of silence that had protected corrupt officers for years began to show signs of strain as the criminal activities became more brazen and widespread. The blue wall of silence that traditionally prevented police officers from reporting misconduct by their colleagues started to develop cracks as some officers became uncomfortable with what they were witnessing. In Baltimore, the first signs that the gun trace task force was operating outside the law came from other police officers who noticed suspicious patterns in their behavior. Some patrol officers reported that task force members were conducting unauthorized searches and seizures in their districts without coordinating with local commanders or following proper procedures. Detective Rayam's aggressive tactics had begun to attract attention from supervisors who were concerned about the number of complaints being filed against him. Citizens were reporting that he had used excessive force during arrests and had taken money and property without providing proper receipts or documentation. While individual complaints might be dismissed as attempts by criminals to avoid prosecution, the pattern of allegations was becoming difficult to ignore. The Federal Bureau of Investigation became involved after receiving tips from multiple sources about potential corruption within the Baltimore Police Department. Some of these tips came from other law enforcement agencies that had observed suspicious behavior during joint operations. Others came from confidential informants who reported that police officers were attempting to sell them drugs or asking them to provide information about potential robbery targets. One of the most significant breaks in the case came when federal agents began monitoring communications between task force members and known drug dealers. Wiretaps revealed that Gondo was providing information to criminals about police operations and helping them avoid arrest. The recordings showed that he was essentially working as a double agent, using his position as a police officer to protect criminal enterprises. The wiretaps also captured conversations in which the officers discussed their illegal activities with shocking casualness. They talked about plans to rob drug dealers, discussed how to divide stolen money, and joked about planting evidence on suspects. The recordings provided federal prosecutors with direct evidence of criminal conspiracies that would have been impossible to prove through other means. In New York, the investigation into the tow truck bribery scheme began when officials noticed unusual patterns in accident response data. Statistical analysis revealed that certain officers were consistently directing business to the same tow truck company, even when other licensed operators were closer to accident scenes or had better response times. The National Insurance Crime Bureau assisted with the investigation by analyzing insurance claims related to accidents handled by the suspect officers. The data showed that Perry's company was receiving a disproportionate share of business from accidents in the 107th precinct, far more than would be expected based on random distribution or normal business practices. Federal agents began conducting surveillance of the suspect officers and documented multiple instances where cash payments were made from Perry to Davnero and Ozma. The surveillance revealed that the payments were being made in parking lots and other locations away from police facilities, suggesting that all parties understood they were engaging in illegal activity. The California investigation was triggered by a combination of citizen complaints and internal affairs investigations. The Antioch Police Department's own internal affairs unit had been receiving reports about officer misconduct for years. but the department had failed to take meaningful action to address the problems. The situation became so serious that Representative Mark DeSaulnier, whose district included Antioch and Pittsburgh, called for the Department of Justice to investigate the Antioch Police Department. The congressman described the actions of the officers as shocking and demanded federal intervention to address what he characterized as a systemic failure of local accountability. Mayor Lamar Thorpe of Antioch had also become a target of his own officers' hostility. Text messages obtained during the Federal Bureau of Investigation revealed that some officers had discussed wanting to shoot the mayor, demonstrating how far their sense of impunity had extended. The mayor later described the situation as terrible and said that the scandal had reduced his city's police force by about half due to officers being fired, arrested, or resigning. The investigation revealed that at least 45 officers had been involved in sending text messages that contained racist, homophobic, and sexist comments. The messages showed a culture of hatred and discrimination that went far beyond the specific criminal charges, suggesting that the problems were embedded in the department's institutional culture. Federal agents also discovered that some officers had been deliberately avoiding wearing body cameras during encounters with the public, making it difficult to document their misconduct. The failure to use required equipment was itself a violation of department policy, but it also suggested that the officers were consciously trying to avoid creating evidence of their illegal activities. The pattern of misconduct was so extensive that it became impossible for supervisors and administrators to continue ignoring it. The combination of federal investigation, media attention, and public outrage created pressure for accountability that could not be deflected or suppressed through traditional means. The federal investigations into police corruption required years of careful work by agents who understood that they were taking on some of the most difficult targets in law enforcement. Corrupt police officers possessed all the skills and knowledge needed to detect and evade surveillance, making it necessary for federal agents to use sophisticated techniques and exercise extraordinary patience. In Baltimore, the Federal Bureau of Investigation began by developing a network of confidential informants who could provide information about the gun trace task force's illegal activities. Some of these informants were drug dealers who had been robbed by the officers and were willing to cooperate in exchange for reduced sentences on their own cases. Others were citizens who had witnessed misconduct and were outraged by what they had seen. The challenge for federal agents was corroborating the information provided by informants who had credibility problems due to their own criminal histories. Drug dealers and other criminals make problematic witnesses in court, so agents needed to find ways to verify their accounts through independent evidence such as surveillance footage, financial records, and electronic communications. Federal agents began conducting extensive surveillance of the task force members, documenting their movements and activities during both their official work hours and their personal time. The surveillance revealed that the officers were frequently meeting with known criminals, visiting locations that had no connection to their official duties, and engaging in activities that suggested they were conducting unauthorized operations. One of the most important breakthroughs came when agents were able to obtain court authorization to place listening devices in vehicles used by the task force members. The recordings captured conversations in which the officers discussed their criminal activities with remarkable openness, apparently believing that they were safe from investigation because of their status as police officers. The wiretaps revealed the full scope of the criminal enterprise, including details about specific robberies, drug sales, and evidence tampering. The officers discussed their crimes with a level of detail that provided federal prosecutors with a roadmap for building criminal cases against them. They talked about which crimes were most profitable, how to avoid detection, and how to intimidate potential witnesses. Federal agents also began analyzing financial records to trace the flow of money from the officers' criminal activities. Bank records showed large cash deposits that could not be explained by their legitimate police salaries. The officers had been careless about hiding their newfound wealth, making purchases and deposits that created a clear paper trail of their illegal income. The investigation expanded to include analysis of the officers' overtime records, which revealed systematic fraud involving hundreds of hours of fake work claims. Federal agents compared the officers' official timesheets with surveillance footage, cell phone records, and other evidence to prove that they had been claiming payment for work they had never performed. In New York, federal agents used a different approach to investigate the tow truck bribery scheme. They began by analyzing patterns in accident response data to identify statistical anomalies that suggested corruption. The data analysis revealed that certain officers were consistently steering business to specific tow truck companies in ways that could not be explained by legitimate factors. Agents then conducted surveillance of the suspect officers and documented multiple instances where cash payments were exchanged between the officers and the tow truck operator. The surveillance included both physical observation and electronic monitoring that captured evidence of the bribery scheme in operation. Federal agents also worked with the National Insurance Crime Bureau to analyze insurance claims related to accidents handled by the suspect officers. The analysis revealed patterns of fraud and abuse that extended beyond simple bribery to include potential insurance fraud and other financial crimes. The California investigation required coordination between multiple federal agencies and local law enforcement organizations. The Federal Bureau of Investigation worked with the Drug Enforcement Administration, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives, and other agencies to gather evidence about the wide range of criminal activities being committed by the corrupt officers. Federal agents conducted raids on the homes and offices of the suspect officers, seizing computers, cell phones, financial records, and other evidence. The raids yielded a treasure trove of evidence, including text messages that showed the officers bragging about their crimes and planning future illegal activities. The text message evidence was particularly damaging because it showed not just individual misconduct, but a culture of corruption that had infected entire units within the police departments. The messages revealed that officers were encouraging each other to commit crimes, sharing techniques for avoiding detection, and celebrating acts of violence against members of the public. Federal agents also discovered that some of the officers had been destroying evidence and obstructing investigations into their misconduct. They had deleted text messages, destroyed documents, and intimidated potential witnesses in attempts to prevent their crimes from being exposed. The investigations required extraordinary resources and coordination because of the complexity of the criminal enterprises and the sophisticated counter-surveillance techniques employed by the corrupt officers. Federal agents had to assume that their targets possessed detailed knowledge of law enforcement procedures and would take steps to avoid detection. When the federal indictments were finally unsealed, they sent shockwaves through law enforcement communities across the country. The charges were so extensive and the evidence so damaging that even experienced prosecutors described the cases as among the most serious police corruption scandals they had ever seen. In Baltimore, 8 members of the Gun Trace Task Force were charged with federal crimes including racketeering, robbery, extortion, and overtime fraud. The indictments detailed a criminal enterprise that had operated for years under the cover of legitimate police work, using the authority of their badges to commit crimes that would have resulted in lengthy prison sentences for ordinary citizens. Wayne Jenkins initially attempted to maintain his innocence, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. Federal prosecutors had recordings of him discussing criminal activities, financial records showing unexplained wealth, and testimony from multiple witnesses who had observed his illegal conduct. Faced with the prospect of spending the rest of his life in prison if convicted at trial, Jenkins eventually agreed to plead guilty to multiple felony charges. In his plea agreement, Jenkins admitted to regularly stealing drugs from people he stopped or arrested, then reselling those drugs through his partnership with the bail bondsman. He acknowledged directing his officers to break open safes and steal money, then creating fake videos to cover up their crimes. He also admitted to planting evidence on innocent people and using his position to intimidate victims who might have been tempted to report his misconduct. Momodu Gondo also pleaded guilty to federal charges, admitting that he had provided information and protection to drug dealers, including childhood friends who were operating heroin distribution networks. He acknowledged that he had used police tracking devices to help plan burglaries and had routinely stolen cash from people's homes during searches. Jamel Rayam's testimony during the trial proceedings was particularly emotional. He broke down in tears while listening to recordings of himself and other task force members failing to provide aid to victims of a serious car accident that they had caused while pursuing their own criminal activities. His admission that it could have been any of us, any of you, my mother, my father, showed the human cost of the corruption that had consumed the unit. 2 officers, Daniel Hersel and Marcus Taylor, refused to accept plea agreements and demanded jury trials. Their decision to fight the charges meant that the full scope of the task force's criminal activities would be revealed in open court, providing the public with detailed testimony about how the corruption had operated. The trial testimony revealed shocking details about the extent of the criminal enterprise. Witnesses described how Jenkins had maintained a cache of weapons and tools for conducting home invasions, including brass knuckles, machetes, and black masks. They testified about robberies in which hundreds of thousands of dollars had been stolen from drug dealers, and about innocent people who had been sent to prison based on planted evidence. The evidence presented at trial included recordings of the officers joking about their crimes and discussing plans for future illegal activities. The recording showed that they viewed their criminal enterprise as a game, competing with each other to see who could steal the most money and commit the most audacious crimes. Despite their vigorous defense efforts, Herschel and Taylor were convicted on multiple felony charges. The jury found that the evidence of their participation in the criminal enterprise was clear and convincing, and that their claims of innocence were not credible in light of the extensive documentation of their illegal activities. In New York, the 3 officers charged in the tow truck bribery scheme also faced overwhelming evidence of their guilt. Federal prosecutors presented surveillance footage showing cash payments being exchanged, statistical analysis proving the pattern of favoritism, and testimony from witnesses who had observed the corruption firsthand. James Davnero, Giancarlo Osma, and Michael Perry all eventually pleaded guilty to federal charges rather than risk conviction at trial and the longer sentences that would likely result. Their plea agreements required them to admit their guilt publicly and to cooperate with ongoing investigations into potential additional corruption within the New York Police Department. In California, the 10 officers charged in the corruption scandal faced a wide range of charges reflecting the diversity of their criminal activities. Some were charged with educational fraud, others with drug distribution, and still others with civil rights violations for their abuse of citizens. The California cases were particularly complex because they involved multiple types of crimes committed by officers in different departments over extended periods. Federal prosecutors had to present evidence showing how the corruption had infected the culture of entire police units and had been allowed to continue unchecked by supervisors and administrators. The trials revealed that the corruption had been enabled by a lack of oversight and accountability within the police departments. Supervisors had failed to investigate obvious warning signs of misconduct, and administrators had failed to implement effective controls to prevent abuse of authority. Many of the officers eventually pleaded guilty when faced with the strength of the evidence against them. The combination of surveillance footage, electronic communications, financial records, and witness testimony made it virtually impossible for them to claim innocence credibly. The sentencing phase of the corruption cases provided an opportunity for judges to send a clear message about the seriousness of police misconduct and the consequences of betraying the public trust. Federal judges across the country imposed substantial prison sentences that reflected both the severity of the crimes and the special obligation that police officers have to uphold the law. Wayne Jenkins received the harshest sentence of all the corrupt officers, 25 years in federal prison. The judge who imposed the sentence noted that Jenkins had been the leader of the criminal enterprise and had used his position of authority to commit particularly serious crimes. The 25-year sentence meant that Jenkins, who was 37 years old at the time of sentencing, would not be eligible for release until he was in his early 60s. The sentence reflected the judge's view that Jenkins had committed a fundamental betrayal of his oath as a police officer and had caused immeasurable damage to public trust in law enforcement. The judge noted that Jenkins had not only committed crimes himself, but had corrupted other officers and had created a culture of criminality within his unit. Jenkins was sent to serve his sentence at a federal prison in Kentucky, far from his home in Baltimore, and from the community where he had committed his crimes. The distance was intended both as punishment and as protection, since corrupt police officers are often targets of violence from other inmates who have been victimized by law enforcement. Momodu Gondo received a 10-year sentence for his role in the criminal enterprise. The judge acknowledged that Gondo had been a follower rather than a leader, but noted that his use of his community connections to facilitate crimes was particularly troubling. Gondo was sent to serve his sentence at a federal prison in North Carolina, with a scheduled release date in 2025. Jamel Rayam received a 12-year sentence, reflecting his extensive involvement in the criminal activities and his history of misconduct that preceded his participation in the task force. Rayam was sent to serve his sentence at a secure medical detention facility in Minnesota, where he could receive treatment for health issues while remaining in federal custody. His scheduled release date is May of 2027. Daniel Herschel and Marcus Taylor, who had insisted on going to trial rather than accepting plea agreements, received 18-year sentences each. The judge noted that their decision to fight the charges rather than accepting responsibility had cost them the opportunity for reduced sentences that might have been available through cooperation with prosecutors. Herschel was sent to serve his sentence at a federal prison in Missouri, while Taylor was assigned to a facility in northeast Arkansas. Both men continued to maintain their innocence even after conviction, with Herschel writing letters to media outlets protesting his treatment and claiming that he had been wrongly convicted. Maurice Ward and Evodio Hendricks, who had played smaller roles in the criminal enterprise and had cooperated with federal prosecutors, received 7-year sentences each. Both men were released in February of 2022 after serving less than 5 years behind bars, reflecting the benefits of accepting responsibility and providing assistance to the investigation. Sergeant Thomas Ullers, another supervisor who had facilitated the corruption, received a 15-year sentence and was sent to serve his time at a federal prison in Florida. His scheduled release date is June of 2030, reflecting the judge's view that supervisors who enable corruption bear special responsibility for the crimes committed by their subordinates. In New York, the 3 officers involved in the tow truck bribery scheme received sentences ranging from 1 to 5 years in federal prison. The lighter sentences reflected the fact that their crimes, while serious, were less extensive than the Baltimore corruption and did not involve violence or the same level of systematic abuse of authority. James Davnero and Giancarlo Osma each received 5-year sentences for their roles in steering business to Michael Perry's tow truck company. Michael Perry, who had retired from the police department before the scheme was discovered, received a 3-year sentence for paying bribes and participating in the conspiracy. The California officers received a range of sentences depending on their specific crimes and their level of cooperation with federal prosecutors. Those who had engaged in civil rights violations and violence against citizens received the longest sentences, while those whose crimes were limited to fraud received shorter terms of imprisonment. Beyond the prison sentences, all of the convicted officers faced substantial financial penalties. They were required to pay restitution to victims of their crimes, forfeit property that had been purchased with illegal proceeds, and pay fines that reflected the seriousness of their misconduct. The Baltimore Police Department faced additional consequences in the form of civil settlements with victims of the Gun Trace Task Force's crimes. The city agreed to pay more than $13 million in settlements with people who had been robbed, assaulted, or falsely imprisoned by the corrupt officers. The settlements provided some measure of compensation to victims, but could not fully repair the damage that had been done to their lives and to community trust in law enforcement. Hundreds of criminal cases that had been worked by the corrupt officers had to be reviewed, and many were dismissed entirely. Prosecutors determined that evidence collected by officers who had been proven to lie and steal could not be trusted, leading to the release of some defendants and the reduction of charges against others. The police corruption scandals that swept through Baltimore, New York, and California forced law enforcement agencies across the country to confront uncomfortable truths about the culture and systems that had allowed such extensive misconduct to flourish unchecked for years. In Baltimore, the Gun Trace Task Force scandal prompted a comprehensive review of police department policies and procedures. The department implemented new oversight mechanisms designed to prevent the kind of unsupervised operation that had enabled the criminal enterprise to operate for so long. The Baltimore Police Department established new requirements for the supervision of specialized units like the Gun Trace Task Force. Officers working in these units are now required to work in pairs, submit detailed reports about their activities, and undergo regular review by supervisors who are specifically trained to identify signs of potential misconduct. The department also implemented new financial controls designed to prevent overtime fraud and other forms of theft from taxpayers. Officers are now required to provide detailed documentation of their work activities, and supervisors are required to verify claims before approving overtime payments. Commissioner Michael Harrison, who took over leadership of the Baltimore Police Department after the scandal, emphasized the importance of cultural change within the organization. In interviews, he acknowledged that the department had been through a lot and committed to retraining, relearning, and reteaching a better way to deliver police services here in Baltimore. The Baltimore Police Department remains under a federal consent decree that requires the implementation of reforms designed to address civil rights violations and improve accountability. The consent decree provides ongoing oversight by federal monitors who review department policies, investigate complaints, and ensure that promised reforms are actually implemented. Community policing initiatives have become a central part of the department's efforts to rebuild trust with the residents of Baltimore. Officers are now required to participate in regular community meetings, and the department has established new mechanisms for receiving and investigating complaints from citizens. The New York Police Department responded to the tow truck bribery scandal by implementing new controls over the Directed Accident Response Program. The department now uses random assignment systems to determine which tow truck companies respond to accidents, reducing the opportunity for officers to show favoritism in exchange for bribes. The department also implemented new training programs designed to educate officers about the legal and ethical requirements of their positions. These programs emphasize the serious consequences of corruption and provide officers with guidance about how to report suspected misconduct by their colleagues. In California, the corruption scandals in Antioch and Pittsburgh led to comprehensive reviews of hiring, training, and supervision practices in both departments. The investigations revealed that warning signs of potential misconduct had been ignored for years, allowing problems to escalate into serious criminal behavior. The California Department of Justice conducted an independent review of the Antioch Police Department and issued recommendations for reforms designed to prevent future corruption. These recommendations included changes to recruitment and hiring practices, enhanced training programs, and improved systems for investigating complaints about officer misconduct. Mayor Lamar Thorpe of Antioch described the corruption scandal as one of the darkest moments in this city's history, but also as an opportunity to build a better police department. The city recruited new officers with a focus on finding candidates who were committed to ethical policing and community service. The scandal also prompted legislative action in California designed to strengthen oversight of police departments and improve accountability mechanisms. New laws require more extensive background checks for police officers, mandate reporting of misconduct by colleagues, and provide additional protections for whistleblowers who report corruption. Across all three jurisdictions, the corruption scandals highlighted the importance of independent oversight and investigation of police misconduct. The crimes were ultimately exposed not by internal police investigations, but by federal agents who had the resources and authority to conduct thorough investigations without interference from local political pressures. The scandals also demonstrated the value of community involvement in police accountability. In many cases, the initial reports of misconduct came from citizens who were willing to come forward despite the risks involved in challenging powerful police officers. Law enforcement experts noted that the corruption cases showed how quickly problems can escalate when proper oversight mechanisms are not in place. Small compromises and minor rule violations can quickly grow into major criminal enterprises if they are not detected and addressed promptly. The cases also highlighted the importance of creating cultures within police departments that encourage ethical behavior and discourage misconduct. When officers believe that corruption is tolerated or even rewarded, they are more likely to engage in illegal activities themselves. Training programs now emphasize not just the legal requirements of police work, but the ethical obligations that come with carrying a badge and exercising authority over other citizens. Officers are taught that their primary responsibility is to serve and protect the public, not to enrich themselves or abuse their power. The corruption scandals have also led to increased use of technology to monitor police activities and detect potential misconduct. Body cameras, GPS tracking of police vehicles, and electronic monitoring of evidence handling have all become more common as departments seek to prevent the kind of systematic abuse that characterized these cases. The police corruption scandals that unfolded in Baltimore, New York, and California serve as stark reminders that the badge does not place anyone above the law. These cases show us that justice can prevail, even when those sworn to uphold it have betrayed their oaths and violated the public trust. Wayne Jenkins, once a respected sergeant leading an elite police unit, now sits in a federal prison cell in Kentucky, serving a 25-year sentence for his crimes. Mamadou Gondo, who used his community connections to facilitate corruption, is imprisoned in North Carolina until 2025. Jamel Rayam, Daniel Hersel, Marcus Taylor, and the other corrupt officers are scattered across federal prisons nationwide, paying the price for their betrayal of the badge. The tow truck bribery scheme in New York was dismantled, the educational fraud in California was exposed, and the civil rights violations that terrorized communities were brought to light. In each case, federal investigators proved that no one is above the law, regardless of their position or power. But perhaps the most important lesson from these cases is not about the punishment of criminals, but about the resilience of our system of justice. When local accountability mechanisms failed, federal investigators stepped in. When supervisors looked the other way, whistleblowers came forward. When corruption seemed entrenched, citizens demanded change. The millions of dollars in settlements paid to victims provided some measure of justice for those who had been robbed and abused. The dismissal of hundreds of tainted criminal cases ensured that prosecutions built on lies and planted evidence would not stand. The implementation of new oversight mechanisms and training programs offers hope that such systematic corruption will be harder to hide in the future. These scandals remind us that democracy depends on accountability, and accountability depends on citizens who are willing to demand justice, even when it is uncomfortable or difficult. The corruption was ultimately exposed not because of the systems that were supposed to prevent it, but because people refused to accept that such behavior was normal or acceptable. The officers who committed these crimes believed they were untouchable, that their badges would protect them from consequences. They were wrong. The federal agents who investigated them, the prosecutors who charged them, and the judges who sentenced them proved that justice may be delayed, but it cannot be denied forever. Today, those corrupt officers are behind bars where they belong, and the communities they terrorized are working to rebuild trust in law enforcement. New officers have been hired, new policies have been implemented, and new hope has been kindled that police departments can serve and protect rather than rob and abuse. If you found this case as shocking as we did, make sure to subscribe to Criminal Mind Cortex for more incredible true crime accounts that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about justice and accountability. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our latest investigations into the most mind-bending cases from around the world, where corruption is exposed, justice prevails, and the truth finally comes to light.